My name is Donniel Statman. I teach philosophy at the University of Haifa. I do mainly ethics, a bit of Jewish philosophy too. This year I'm a fellow at the Institute in a research group working on issues that have to do with ethics, war, and Judaism. We work a lot with the army. We have officers, some of them senior officers coming to the Institute and working with us on issues regarding military ethics, ethics of war, and so on. We're going to talk this evening about issues regarding Judaism and democracy. So I'll start with a few introductory comments and then I'll introduce the other panelists. In the 1990s, in the early 1990s, a stormy debate on the relation between democracy and Judaism erupted on the Israeli scene. It took no time before the tension between these two notions was felt everywhere. Catch expressions like the problem of democracy and Judaism became code words for a whole cluster of problems concerning inter alia, the Jewish character of the State of Israel, the peace process, the moral status of Zionism, the limits of liberalism, and so on. To inquire into the relationship between democracy and Judaism sounds an embarkation on a theoretical research project. But as I see it, in the current debate, the issues are primarily political and ideological, and the emotion evoked by this material have been very heated indeed. At any rate, within a very short period, not only was the problematic nature of the relation between democracy and Judaism generally accepted, I mean that there is a problem here, but so was the notion that the two terms are incompatible, that a necessary conflict between these two notions exists. We can call this the conflict thesis. It is very interestingly supported by two opposing groups in Israeli society for different reasons. Secular liberals tend to support it because they want to minimize the role of religion in the public sphere, while some religious people support it because they wish to emphasize the absolute authority of the law of the Torah. This common interest in the conflict thesis has no doubt contributed to its wide acceptance. A political theorist looking at this development from the outside would surely find the conflict thesis quite odd. To be sure, the exact role of religion within liberal democracies is a matter of ongoing debate in the US and in other countries. But very rarely would we find any serious thinker in the liberal tradition saying that Christianity, for instance, and democracy necessarily conflict. In fact, for a while, the opposite view was held by Christian believers who assumed an essential connection between religion and democracy. I refer to the view on the religion of democracy, which was developed in the early 20th century America, and which finds expression in the quotations like the following: democracy is not merely political theory, it is not merely a social opinion, it is a profound religious faith. Or a different quotation: democracy is at one with religion in its conception of what the full-grown and civilized man ought to be, and so on. I doubt whether many Christians in the US would accept such a sacred view of democracy today, but they would no doubt reject the opposing suggestion that there is a necessary conflict between religion and democracy. I mentioned these facts at the outset just to give you a sense of how far-fetched and exaggerated the conflict thesis is from the point of view of political theory. That it is nevertheless held and argued for raises the suspicion that the conflict thesis is not so much a conceptual or a theoretical thesis about the relation between democracy and Judaism, as it is a normative position vis-à-vis fundamental questions in Israeli ideology and politics. The purpose of this panel today is to shed light on these issues and see whether indeed we have a genuine question before us, and if we do, how to answer it. We have three panelists. Annabel Herzog teaches at the Department of Political Science at Haifa. I think she's a familiar face for many of you who participate in the seminar. So she'll be our first speaker. Then Professor Karayanni, who teaches at the law school at the Hebrew University. And our host, Donniel Hartman, will conclude. Annabel.
Thank you very much, Danny. Good evening. I'm very honored to be here tonight. I was supposed to attend the entire week of workshop, but my daughter is starting her army service this week, and so I had to stay with her for the last days before she goes to 3 years of intensive service.
She had to stay with you.
Yeah, she had, yeah, absolutely. Good. So, it's puzzling that the question of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state has lately become so much fashionable. Why is that so? As Danny just said, it's a new concern. It appeared in the 80s and in the 90s as new basic laws. And the general question is whether these laws express an existing reality or whether they create a new reality or whether they try to create such a new reality. The expression includes 3 words: state, Jewish, democratic. These words are so simple that we could feel that there's nothing to discuss at all. Israel is a state. It's the state of Israel. It was created by and for the Jews. It's called Israel. And it has a mainstream democratic system with 3 elections, a parliament, a Supreme Court, minorities, and all the regular challenges of democracies. Therefore, of course, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, like it's a sunny and small state. Jewish and democratic is a mere description of what Israel obviously is. However, none of these words, state, democratic, and Jewish, is that simple. A state, yes, Israel is a state, but it has no clearly defined borders. What does that mean exactly today at the time of globalization? What does that mean not to have clearly defined borders in a post-colonialism era? What does that mean when 2 nations at least have a claim on land and sovereignty in this part of the world? A democracy, yes. Israel has democratic institutions, but ancient Athens had democratic institutions. The Weimar Republic had a democratic institution. Great Britain and France today have democratic institutions, and they are all very, very different regimes. So, and Jewish, yes, Jewish, but what does that mean exactly? A place ruled by Jewish law, a place where the Jews constitute the majority of the population, a place where Jewish symbols and Jewish values shape collective life. But what are exactly these symbols and these values? What makes them Jewish? So when we start to interpret these terms and clarify what they mean and what we mean when we talk about Jewish and democratic, we discover that Jewish and democratic do not necessarily get on together the way sunny and small get on together. I would even say that state and Jewish do not necessarily get on. No one needs to be reminded that the Jewish state has not always existed and that Jews have lived and still live forms of collective Jewish life independently of a Jewish state. It's an amazing success of the state of Israel to make us feel that anything that would be less than a Jewish and democratic state would lack something, would not be enough, would be incomplete, unfair, against our natural rights, against history, against political normalcy, against progress, against modernity, against morals, against Judaism itself, as if the idea of Jewish life, the best possible Jewish life, was life in a Jewish and democratic state. So what I would like to do tonight is show that the formulation Jewish and democratic state is totally unclear and ambiguous, because each of its terms has many meanings. I won't be able to focus on all these meanings, but I'll show that democratic includes at least 2 main meanings, Jewish at least 3 main meanings, and state at least 2 main meanings. Namely, when we speak about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, we talk about at least 12 hypothetical realities. And it doesn't make our situation simple in the least. Indeed, there is no general agreement about the meaning of that expression, about a meaning that we would all use. People speak about Jewish and democratic to express very different things, and they condone or reject these things. So there are 2 points here. The first is the conceptual ambiguity of the expression, and the second is the lack of ideological and cultural agreement about this expression. As a result, Jewish and democratic mean almost everything, and therefore almost nothing. So I'll start with democratic. We often forget that it includes 2 very different theories or traditions or sources. The first is what I will call here participatory democracy, and the second is liberalism. What we today call democracy is the hybrid of these 2 things, participatory democracy and liberalism. And that's why it's sometimes emphasized that democracy is liberal democracy. What does that mean? What I call participatory democracy is a political system in which the citizens rule. The basic idea is that the people are the sovereign. This in itself can mean many different things, and we already see that even 2 combinations of our terms don't begin to account for every possibility. It can mean that the citizens take all decisions, or that they make the law, or that they elect representatives to take decisions and or to make the law. It can mean that it's a system in which the majority wins, but it can also mean that it's a system in which the minority is respected and taken into account. It can mean that all citizens are equal under the law and that they have equal opportunity to participate to political life. It can mean that they are free to have political opinions, free to be members of political parties, etc., etc., etc. Liberalism is a tradition of thought, a set of philosophical and political values that we can here sum up under the term rights. Liberalism includes the rights to life, to security, to liberty, to property, to happiness, and many others. Today the list is very, very long. Right to education, to health, to well-being, to cultural life. Enjoying arts is considered a right in the UN Rights Declaration. To go to the opera, it's a right. These rights are said to be natural and universal. That is, they are the rights of all members of the human family. Of course, the first liberals didn't think that women or black people were included into these definitions, but they didn't mind being inconsistent in denying rights to women or blacks. But today it's absolutely admitted that all members of the human family possess all rights. The tendency is even to enlarge the family to non-human members and to give rights to animals. Democrats and liberals have a few common values, but they are far from being identical. The first Democrats, the Greeks of Athens, were not liberal at all. Well, liberalism didn't exist. And the first liberals were extremely aristocratic. But during the 19th century, liberal countries realized that the best way to implement liberal values was to spread them through democratic procedures. Thus, liberal democracy was born. It's a whole, but a hybrid. Its hybridity is perceptible in the 2 institutions included in all liberal democracies: a parliament in which democratic work is done, and a Supreme Court or constitutional court which take care of the basic rights with judicial review on laws. So Israel was founded as a liberal democracy without using these terms at that time. It's written in the Declaration of Independence that Israel will, I quote, ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture, etc. And therefore, when we say that Israel is a democracy, we face the problem of its hybridity on the one hand, and the fact that the concepts are ambiguous and open on the other hand. Some will say it's a democracy, and therefore the Knesset has the right to rule as it wishes. Some will say it's a democracy, and therefore the Supreme Court has the right to control the Knesset. Some will say it's a democracy, and therefore the citizens rule, and the citizens should include the Jews and those who are faithful to the Jews. Some will say it's a democracy, and therefore all human members living in Israel should get equal rights, etc. Now let's speak about the Jewish part of Jewish and democratic. It seems to me that when we say Jewish and democratic, we mean three main meanings. These meanings are not mutually exclusive, but I will speak about each one of them separately. The first meaning is belonging to the Jews. The second is following the Jewish law. And the third is Zionist. There are certainly other meanings, but today we'll focus on these three only. So let's speak first of belonging to the Jews. Well, Israel was created by the Jews and for the Jews. The Jews came here, bought lands, worked the land, built cities, recreated the language. The Israeli flag shows Jewish symbols, the Star of David and the Talit's blue stripes. The people represented on banknotes are Jews. The national anthem speaks about Jewish political dreams. There are non-Jews in the country, mainly Arabs. But they are here because they were here and they stayed. So they are a minority. And in the Israeli ethos, in the general Israeli narrative, they are supposed to remain a minority. Second meaning, following the Jewish law. For many Israeli Jews, the fact that Jewish means belonging to the Jews or related to the Jews is not enough or even is inaccurate. For them, Jewish doesn't mean anything related to the Jews, but one special thing, the law given by God to the children of Israel. Many rabbis and religious people think that way, but not only them. When you push them a little bit, many non-religious people, or not very observant people, admit that what's authentically Jewish is the religious law, even if they don't observe it at all. Namely, Shabbat, dietary laws, but also laws of marriage and sexual interdictions, and as we lately saw, modesty, etc. The problem is that there is not one single way to understand the Jewish law, not two ways. Not even three ways. There are plenty of ways. From its birth, the Jewish law has consisted of endless discussions and interpretations about its meanings and its essence. From the beginning, Judaism as a theological, spiritual, and religious movement has been characterized by various trends. And therefore, when Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox rabbis claim that the state should follow the Jewish law, they often don't agree with each other about what it would mean. And of course, they immediately have to face non-Orthodox or non-ultra-Orthodox opponents who have a different understanding of what the Jewish law means. Now, the last meaning of Jewish when we say Jewish and democratic, Zionist. It means that the state reflects, or should reflect, a certain version, the Zionist version, or a Zionist version, of the ideology and general values of the Jews. Jewish here means that the Jews are a well-defined and identified people, which has been through tribulations and adventures, mostly sad ones, far from its original land and desperately longing for it, and it was almost totally destroyed in the Holocaust. But against all predictions, it survived and gloriously settled back on its territory of origin. That version of Jewish, with all its components, including the Holocaust, is that explicitly chosen by Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak, one of the masterminds of the Jewish and democratic basic laws. In one of his rulings, he writes, quote, "What, then, are the core characteristics shaping the minimum definition of the State of Israel as a Jewish state? These characteristics come from the aspects of both Zionism and heritage. Hebrew is the official and principal language of the state, and most of his fests and symbols reflect the national revival of the Jewish people." End of quote. It's important to emphasize here that Barak claims to speak about two things, Zionism and the Jewish heritage. However, this heritage is perceived through the Zionist lens. Zionism and heritage are not two things, but one thing, Jewish experience according to the Zionist narrative. The Holocaust itself is integrated to the Zionist perspective. In a very interesting paper dedicated to Jewish and democratic that he wrote, Aaron Barak, he concludes with some autobiographical details. Quote, I was born in 1936 in Kovno, Lithuania. In 1941, I was put in the ghetto. Out of thousands, only a few survived. My life was saved by a non-Jewish Lithuanian, a righteous Gentile. What have I learned from all this? First, the centrality of the State of Israel and its Jewish character in the life of the Jewish people, and the need to guarantee the future security and welfare of the Zionist state and its Jewish character. So now let's say a few words about the state, the third word, Jewish and democratic state. So now the state. The state of Israel is a nation state. A nation state must be differentiated from a federation or a confederation or an empire, and is the manifestation of the coincidence of a territory, political sovereignty, culture, language, and identity. However, it exists in two main versions and many hybrid versions. The two main versions are civic state and ethnic state. A civic nation state is founded on the idea, it's an idea, a mental representation, of a civic nation, namely a body of citizens who receive citizenship independently of ethnicity or religion. All persons who play the game of a specific state, namely who follow its laws, can be accepted as citizens according to specific procedures. A civic state is a state of all its citizens. An ethnic nation state is founded on the idea, here too it's a mental representation, of an ethnic nation based on a common descent, namely blood ties. To be a citizen of an ethnic state, you must be biologically related to the ethnic group that forms the state or the majority of the state. The law of return reflects the fact that Israel is an ethnic state. In Israel, some people would like state to mean civic state, namely to mean state of all its citizens. However, as it stands now, Israel is obviously closer to an ethnic nation state. However, it's a strange ethnic state. Indeed, you can join the biological group and get political citizenship via religious conversion. I repeat, to become a political citizen of the state of Israel, you need to be part of the biological people, and to become part of the biological people, you need to convert to the Jewish religion. That's interesting. That's a strange situation. So now we have an idea of what Israel as a democratic and Jewish state can mean. It can mean many, many different things. And when people argue about the Jewish and democratic character of Israel, they do not necessarily speak about the same thing, and they do not necessarily understand each other. Moreover, some meanings entail a contradiction. For instance, when Supreme Court former Chief Justice Aaron Barak claims that, quote, in my view, the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people. It must be secure and strong. Immigration must be increased and Zionism strengthened. At the same time, and with no contradiction, the state must defend the dignity and freedom of every person living within it, whether Jewish or not, end of quote. And when he then says that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, by Jewish he means that Israel belongs to the Jews and is Zionist. By democratic, he means that it is a liberal state. And by state, he means that it's an ethnic state and not the state of all its citizens. And I'm not sure that he is right when he says that all this together doesn't entail any contradiction. However, the problem, as I conceive it, is not the conceptual non-clarity, which is unavoidable. And it is not the lack of agreement about the meaning of the formulation Jewish and democratic. The problem is the Israeli context of nationalism, the fact of Israel as a nation state and as an ethnic nation state. The argument between Jewish and democratic and what does each term really mean alone and in relation to the other is constructive and positive when it occurs between Jews about the nature of a Jewish societies. And indeed, it is the argument we Jews have been having since emancipation and the onset of modernity. And it is crucial to the continued existence of Jewish life. But Israel is not a Jewish society. And the same argument about Jewish and democratic, when it occurs between Jews and non-Jews in Israel, is disastrous and also insoluble. What needs to change is the construction of Israel as an ethnic nation-state. If we were living in a confederated binational political entity, call it what you will, then the Jews could argue about the nature of our part of that entity at our leisure, without inflicting on everyone else. Therefore, what I'm saying to conclude is that in order to save Zionism, to save the vision of Jewish independence, we must renounce what has been seen to be the essence of the Zionist vision of statehood, nationalist sovereignty. Thank you very much.
My presentation tonight is descriptive. I'm not going to argue a normative thesis, but I'm going to try to describe a certain reality that exists in Israel and try to theorize on what I conceive as an Israeli reality within the realm of religion and state. And I would like to start with this observation I found in one of Israel's leading constitutional treaties by Amnon Rubinstein and my colleague at the Hebrew University, Barak Medina. When I was asked to write a commentary on this treatise, and being interested in religion and state in Israel, actually more on issues of private international law and interreligious law in Israel, so I went straight to the subject index of the treatise. And I looked up the entry of religion and state in Israel. And this is what I found. Religion and state C, Jewish state. Datum dina, re'u medina Yehudit. And I was really puzzled. Why is that so? Israel, in terms of religion, is very diverse. Besides the Jewish majority, we have 13 other religious communities that are recognized by law, meaning that under the long-standing millet system of the Ottomans, these communities have the power to establish their own courts and legislate their own norms, especially in matters of marriage and divorce. And yet, when we discuss religion and state in Israel, it's restricted only to the issue of a Jewish state. Now, for those of you that do not know much about the statistics in Israel, so I have this slide. This is the total population. It's from the 2009, give and take, some 100,000 in total or a bit more, but this is almost what exists today. Jews about 5.5 million, Muslims are about 1.2 million, Christians 150,000, and the Druze 120,000. When we come to the Christian communities, there are 10 different Christian communities that are recognized by law. In terms of the existing churches, there are more, but these are the recognized Christian religious communities. So you have 10 different Christian communities that are recognized: the Muslims, the Druze, and the Baha'is, which were also recognized back in the early 1970s. And together with the Jewish majority, we have in all 14 different religious communities that exist. But when we discuss religion and state, it's just a Jewish state. And this got me going on a research project that I started about 7 or 8 years ago and been publishing all kinds of stuff about it, trying to explain why is this so. And I came up with a thesis, which is descriptive, as I said, explaining why this is exactly the case. I mean, if you open any treatise on religion and state in Israel, and it's called Religion and State in Israel, or any article, scholarly article, you would find that discussion constrained to the issue of the conflict between recognizing Jewish religious norms or Jewish religious institutions on the one hand, and Israel's proclaimed liberal democratic norms on the other hand. And that's the discussion. And that's what's handled by all of these different scholars. And these scholars, at least in the past, used to come from one portion of the society in Israel, the Kippot Srugot. They were the one who were handling religion and state in Israel. And they were defining the discourse and all of what came out from that conflict. And my thesis said that there are two different paradigms that exist, the relationship between religion and state in Israel. One paradigm for the Jewish majority, and another different paradigm for the Palestinian Arab minority and its different religious communities. In terms of the Jewish community, the paradigm is the establishment of the Jewish religion in the state of Israel. Judaism is an established religion in the state of Israel because of what we just heard, that Israel is a Jewish state. And therefore, this dictates that there should be a special privileged status of Judaism in Israel as a Jewish state. And that has different implications. One major implication is the amount of legislation recognizing different religious institutions that are only Jewish. You have legislation dealing with the recognition of religious councils, the chief rabbinate, kosher food, the prohibition of opening places of entertainment on Jewish sacred.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to be this evening completely normative. I would not live in Israel if Israel was not a Jewish and democratic state. It wouldn't be Israel if it wasn't Jewish, and it would not be Israel if it was not democratic. And therefore, as you say you said in your introduction, if the two are incompatible, we don't merely have a conceptual challenge, we have an existential crisis. And the reason why so many Israelis get so nervous about this question, and the reason why possibly we also focus on the Jewish democratic dimension, is because this is an existential crisis for us. Is this a country that we want to live in? Is this the country that we want to commit ourselves to, and our children to, and our grandchildren to? Now, most Israelis believe that Israel is and should be a Jewish and democratic state. Roughly with that statement, the thinking on the issue comes to an end. Worrying continues. Debate continues. Thinking ends. And there's a very big difference. For most Israelis, a Jewish democratic state is a state that is a little Jewish and a little democratic. And what does that mean? It means, in some Talmudic division, that we know that we're going to have to give up a little bit on Judaism in certain cases for it to be democratic, but, and here's the flip side, we also believe that it's okay to give up on a little democracy so that it'll be Jewish. Now what happens when you've already given up on certain standards, it's easy, you're already on a slippery slope. I want to be normative. Start with a normative statement. For me, Israel must be Jewish and democratic, but it can only be as Jewish as democracy allows and not as democratic as Judaism allows. Herein lies a critical decision which will divide much of the debate in our society. And one of the difficulties that we face is that when you are on a different side of the equation, it's almost you're in a completely different discourse. And your ability to argue, your ability to bridge is very, very limited. One of the great challenges that we face conceptually is, can Israel be as Jewish as democracy allows and still be sufficiently Jewish for the Zionist self-understanding of what this country means and what this country is about? That's the test. That's the question. And tonight I'd like to outline very briefly how one might think about this question, or how I think about this question, and how I would like a lot of other people to think about this question. Because the bottom line is nothing less than the future of this country. For I believe that to be a Jew is not simply to worry about survival, but to be a Jew is to see survival as an opportunity and a responsibility to create a survival and a life of meaning. And when you don't do that, you create an idolatrous entity. And a state of Israel which is not subject to that aspiration becomes an end unto itself and is idolatrous. I would like to play with a number of the categories that Annabel and Michael spoke about. The Jewishness of Israel starts with the fact that this is the sovereign expression of the Jewish people. That's where it begins. That's the basic meaning. And many people who have difficulty with the Jewish nature of the country understand the Jewish nature of the country and its ability to coexist with democracy, believe that Jewish means primarily, as Annabel said, Jewish as in Jewish religion. And the parallel between Jewish democracy would be Christian democracy. And the slight difference between the ability of Christianity to coexist within democracy and the question we're dealing with is not whether a Christian could be in a democratic state, but whether you can have a Christian democratic state. That's the issue that we're struggling with here, whether you can have a Jewish democratic state. So the first feature of this country, as outlined by my colleagues, is that this is the homeland of the Jewish people. And it's Jewish, and it's a particular feature of Judaism, that Judaism is not simply a system which defines how you're supposed to live your life with fellow human beings and with God, but it is a national identity. The collective identity, being part of a collective, being part of a people, and constituting a separate and distinct national entity, has been integral to the term Jewish since its inception. When God says to Abraham, go forth from your father's house, from your land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. He doesn't then say to Abraham, and I'll take care of you, and you'll have a great life, and I'll plant you in a Garden of Eden. He says to Abraham, V'escha l'gai gadol, I will make of you a great nation. The minute the conversation of Jewish begins in our tradition, God basically says to Abraham, it's not about you, stupid. My election of you was not to find another individual. Another individual, a little better Noah. You know, someone who's a little more morally committed to the surrounding than Noah was, who maybe would have complained to God before the flood and not built the ark so quickly. That's a rabbinic midrash. My aim with you, Abraham, is to create a nation. Jewishness and national identity are integrated from the beginning of our conversation. It's what we understand. So the first dimension of Jewish is that this is the homeland of the Jewish people, of this nation. But one of the features of a nation is that a nation is not constituted by objects who do not think, do not feel, do not speak. Together with that nation comes its culture, its values, its principles. The choice, or the way Judaism, not Jewish, Judaism enters into the state of Israel, if it is to be a democracy, it's not because it is Jewish in the sense that Jewish law ought to have authority here. It becomes Jewish because this is the culture, the values, the principles which accompany those people who constitute the Jewish nation. And as a result, this is a critical distinction which will make the possibility of democracy within Jewishness viable or not. When the authority of Jewishness in the state of Israel is grounded in some principle of what constitutes authentic Judaism, then you have created you've created a system of authority which is antithetical to democratic institutions, such as a Knesset and a Supreme Court. You have a third institution. And many Israelis, since they're committed to a little Jewish and a little democratic, the little Jewish is, I have Jewish law. And as a result, there is an authority outside of the democratic system, which I have to be loyal to. But when Judaism only enters into this country, not because of some halachic authority, but it enters into the country because of the Jews, its authority comes from being the culture value system of this particular nation group who are coming to form a public sphere, and in their public sphere, that public sphere cannot be value neutral. It's the place in which they breathe, they speak, they give expression to who they are as a nation. What then is the difference? When Jewishness enters the state because of the Jews, and as distinct from because of God, then only those features that reflect either the consensus of those Jews as to Judaism, as to which culture and ideas and values enter into the system, are allowed. Or two, if Jewishness enters in an area where there isn't an almost complete consensus, then there could be no single expression of Jewishness within the public sphere. You don't resolve debate on Jewishness by creating value neutrality. You resolve the disagreement by creating value plurality. Judaism could enter into the public sphere through the Jews, i.e., what are the values that we care about, and what are the principles, traditions, or cultures that we want to bring into this country? So the simple examples are language. Another example is the calendar. Areas where there's a very large consensus. A third area might be certain, as in our Megillat Atzmot, our Declaration of Independence, where they speak about the ethics of the prophets. That's sort of a code word for those things that are nice about Judaism that we want to keep. Because what is exactly the ethics? Like which prophet, which one, which verse? Was it them raging against the idolater, or was it their moment of social justice? So we pick. So the ethics of the prophets is sort of a code word. It's not Jewish law, because that could get yechi. It's just sort of the nice parts of Judaism. But it means, what are the consensual Jewish values? Like, for example, when we have an issue of a soldier who is taken captive, and a lot of the world and our allies talk to us and say, what are you, nuts? What are you, absolutely crazy? Grow up. You're a country. What, the whole country's going to come to a standstill over one person? We don't do that. But we have a little problem. And that one of our little problems starts with the fact that one of the central values of our tradition is that we don't count. And that one life, saving one life, is if you saved the whole world. So when we start the discussion, our values, it created another conversation. Part of our values has a certain core sense of responsibility and seeing the other as a member of a family, and therefore when we start the conversation, we start it in a very different place. Now it doesn't mean we can't debate it. But the value of pidyon shvuim, of redeeming captives, enters into the public discourse. I thought I was in yeshiva. People, what is pidyon shvuim? Are there limits on it and different people? But our values enter into that conversation. In our tradition, the value of having a family is so integral to the way we think about our community. It's a community made up of families. And what happens if somebody can't have a child? So those values enter into our public sphere by creating a system that, out of the limited resources of our health system, you have funded unlimited in vitro fertilization till you're 45, until you have 2 children. For Jew and non-Jew, by the way, alike. That's because that's our values. Values enter into the public sphere when there's an extensive consensus. And those are extremely natural. And they are expressive of the will, not simply of a majority, but a consensual culture of this society. If a value will enter into the public sphere, which there is not a consensus, there isn't a problem for it to do so, so long as it is not the sole expression. And thus, when Judge Cohen says, yes, the rabbinate is a blight on Israel's democracy, he's absolutely correct. Because there isn't a consensus on marriage. There's nothing wrong with having a rabbinate. But if you want to have a rabbinate funded by the state, you have to have multiple rabbinates funded by the state. If you want to have a rabbinate in charge of issues of marriage, then you have to have as well civil marriage. And these two, in order to ensure its liberal democratic standards, are only acceptable to the extent that the inalienable rights of the minority are protected as you give expression to your national identity. And thus, for example, when it comes to the Jewish calendar, which is the official vacation calendar of the State of Israel, we decided that anybody who's not Jewish could pick their calendar and replace. In other words, if you're working in a government office, you could pick either the Jewish calendar or a non-Jewish calendar to be your calendar, which defines the days that you don't have to take sick days or vacation days. And other examples. How do we maintain? You want to bring religion in? You bring it in only to the extent that it reflects what all the Jews or almost all want. To the extent that if it doesn't reflect a majority, it maintains the multiple voices of Judaism, because it is not God's version of Judaism that defines the Judaism of the state. And you all know that when I say God's version of Judaism, it's human beings who are all arguing over who owns God's versions of Judaism. So it's not, this has to be because this is Jewish law. The power of Judaism doesn't grow from some claim of authenticity and tradition. It grows as an expression of what Jews do. Israel is Jewish in the sense that it doesn't get to define what is Judaism. Jews, the living reality of the Jews, does. But what do we do? And very briefly, and with that I'll conclude. We don't ask this question. We say it's going to be a little Jewish and a little democratic. And with that, we begin the marketplace. We begin to trade. It's a little Jewish and a little democratic. How much Jewish do you want? How much democratic do you want? And instead of having a conceptual question, a conceptual conversation which states Israel could be only as Jewish as democracy allows, and how do we ensure that it has a Jewish identity and a Jewish flavor, and how do we make sure that the majority has an opportunity to express itself within the public sphere, and in so doing represent the deepest understanding of what sovereignty means in the context of a nation state within a democratic, within the confines of democracy. We sell it, prostituting both our democratic and our religious conversation. What do you want? And what will you give me? I'll give you an example. Avigdor Lieberman has 15 seats in the Knesset. He represents a community, 33% of which aren't Jewish. A third of those who came from the former Soviet Union aren't Jewish according to the definition of orthodoxy, conservative, or reform in Israel. They came to Israel because Israel accepted the most pluralistic definition of Jewishness of any community in Jewish history. It defined Jewishness not merely in ethnic terms. It defined it in terms of a Jewish mother or a Jewish father, or married to a Jew, or converted to Judaism according to any definition, as long as it's a recognized denomination. Orthodox, conservative, reform. I don't know if Reconstructionists made it. Or if you have a Jewish grandparent. It is this is the type of law which I'm speaking about when I say Judaism enters, because this is the way the Jews, in fact, are defining themselves. Do I like it? That's not about you. Israel isn't your shul. It's not like no one appointed you the rabbi. And the law of return represents that understanding of a broad sense of what Jewishness is. But herein comes the problem. The law of return of Israel applies in only two places. It applies in Ben Gurion Airport and in the army. You're Jewish enough to get into the country and to be hugged at Ben Gurion Airport. The minute you leave, there's a cold shower. All of a sudden, you've entered into, I don't want to call it a marketplace, it's more accurately called a shuk, where somebody bought your right outside of Ben Gurion Airport. And someone said, you know what? I really care about status issues. Give me control of status issues. Keep the Ottoman system going. Give it to me, please. And it's really, really important to you. And someone says, oh, it's really important to you? Okay. But you know what's really important to me? What's really important to me is a budget. Or you know what? What's really important to me is a certain policy in Judea and Samaria. I'll give you a rabbinate if you'll give me a stable coalition. Great. No problem. It's a little Jewish. It's a little Democrat. We sold it. What was the price? And as long as the price isn't too expensive, I'm okay with it. So now along comes Avigdor Lieberman and says, we need to have civil marriages in this country because, you know what? Now I have a group of people who you sold my birthright, and that doesn't work for me because my constituency says I don't want to just be Jewish in Ben Gurion Airport or Jewish enough to be forced to be drafted into the army. I want to be Jewish in order to get married. Or I want to be Jewish for a whole range of other issues. Hello, I need my rights here, and you've sold them. So he stands up and says, my party platform will demand civil marriages in Israel within the first year of the coalition. And the coalition signs the agreement. But then, so Lieberman says, I care. But then Lieberman has a little problem. He encounters somebody else who also cares. In the name of Shas, Eli Yishai. He says, I know you really care, but my constituency also really cares. My constituency, in particular, this rabbinate, There's a lot of jobs. You saw how much money is distributed. My community wants Orthodox marriages in this country. And I've had it, I'm not about to give, I've had this benefit in the past, I'm not going to give it up right now. And so now we enter into a shuk. And guess what we came up with? We didn't come up with a conceptual conversation between Eli Yishai and Avigdor Lieberman. What are the inalienable rights of an individual? We came up with a law which I call the Israeli dating law. Now, just because we were embarrassed, we didn't call it that law. But that's basically what it is. This is the law, and it took 15 years for Israel, 15 years after 5% of Israeli society moves here and could not get married in the state of Israel. It can't get married because they're not Jewish. And they don't apply. They can't go to the other courts, the other ones, because they don't. The only place here you can have a citizen of the state of Israel who the only way they can get married is to go to Cyprus. Now, you all heard of the town Chelm? That's like, we're like in a different category. Like, we wish that we will reach the status of Chelm. Like, I would like to live in Chelm. Instead, I'm living in Israel. What took us 15 years? The following law. Listen carefully. You won't understand me, and that's okay, because it's ununderstandable. Those who see themselves as Jewish, and who the law of return defines as Jewish, but who outside of Ben Gurion Airport aren't defined as Jewish, are allowed to marry those people who see themselves as Jewish, whom the law of return sees them as Jewish, but who outside of Ben Gurion Airport aren't seen as Jewish. Now, those who see themselves as Jewish and are defined as Jewish by the law of return, but who we don't see as Jewish, aren't allowed to marry someone who we don't see as Jewish. The only ones they're allowed to marry are those people who see themselves as Jewish and whom the law of return sees themselves as Jewish. So now, basically, what the country said, 350,000 Russians, I'm going to tell you who you can date. That's why it's the dating law. You can't fall in love. You can't fall in love. That's the compromise. I, Avigdor Lieberman, need a little civil marriage. I, Eli Yishai, need a little rabbinic marriages. What do we come up with? Stupidity. Stupidity. And all of us just walk along and everything is fine. Because I'm not one of the 350,000 people who are now told who they're allowed to date. Don't fall in love. Israel can be a Jewish and democratic state if we work at it. You want to have the country concerned about opportunities of conversion? Wonderful. To have only one conversion in the state of Israel? Only one? Only one way that a person within the state can convert? Why? Because that's what you define as what is authentic or required by law? That's not the way a Jewish and democratic state thinks about these questions. We think about Judaism in terms of the religion of the Jews. That's what Zionism means. That's the essential difference between Zionism or the revolution that Zionism is challenging all of us to think about. When you're not in Israel, you get a right to go to your synagogue and to state, what do I think is authentic Jewish law? And build a synagogue around what you think is authentic. And anybody who doesn't agree with you, you can say to them, wonderful, build your own shul. I don't want you by me. I'm happy when you don't come to me. And an ultra-Orthodox synagogue could sit right next to a Reform synagogue in Manhattan, and nobody for the life of them would think that they have anything to say or any authority over the other. The essence of Zionism is the decision of the Jewish people to build a homeland of the Jewish people. A homeland of the Jewish people is not just where Jews live. It's where we have an opportunity to bring our culture, our values, our principles into the public sphere. How we do so, however, will make all the difference. We can do so within and in accordance with democratic principles, so long as we recognize that Judaism has authority here only because of the Jews, and as long as we recognize that Israel can be as Jewish as democracy allows, and not as democratic as Judaism allows. Thank you.
As each time I hear Donniel, I agree with everything, absolutely everything he says. So I agree with his definition of democracy. I agree with everything he said about Judaism. I agree with all the Jewish values he described and how he described them. I agree with his vision of liberalism, and I agree with his vision of the country 100%. And I also came to this country because it's Jewish. But, not but against what you said, but first, the fact that other people understand Jewish and democracy and democratic in another way doesn't mean that they are wrong. It means that the words allow them to understand Jewish and democratic in another way. And your way to understand it is my way too, and it's the way I would like everybody to understand these words. But it's possible to understand Jewish and democratic in another way. And Lieberman can say, I want this country to be Jewish and democratic, and when he says that, it's absolutely not what you said and what I would say about Jewish and democratic. So we can have many different definitions of these terms. And my second point, my second but, is that everything you said, almost everything you said, is totally right in a Jewish context. You spoke about conversion, you spoke about being Jewish, Jewish values, being all together as Jews, Eli, Shai, and Lieberman and everybody. But again, there are non-Jews here, and they are not concerned at all by this discussion. So if we were only among Jews, everything you said would be totally right, and my story too, because I'm a Jew, and I came here because it's Jewish. But we have to face the fact that democracy is related also to this other part of the population, which is not Jewish, and doesn't care about Eli Shai against Lieberman, or conversion, or reform, conservative, orthodox, which are questions that are extremely important to me, but they are not important to them, because what's important to them is their problem with the Jewish state. And when we speak about Jewish and democratic, we have to speak about that too.
Thank you, especially the part in which you said you always agree with me. I don't want you to always agree with me. It's like, because that sounds like a democracy, like elections in my neighborhood. I want you like most of the time. I don't like 90. Give me like 73% agreement. But I couldn't agree more. I was speaking about one dimension of the challenge within the time allotted, and it was not, and I overspoke, and I apologize. But I agree that the same principles of Israel is correct, that Israel could only be as Jewish as democracy allows, also applies to the democratic rights, inalienable rights of our minority population. But a minority population has inalienable rights, but it does not have the right to constitute or to create a reality which undermines the rights of the majority to reflect its own culture. We have to worry, in a liberal democracy, you have to worry about the dictatorship of the majority. But you also have to worry about the dictatorship of a minority. Now, Israel is not or the constitution of a nation state, which is a sovereign state which forms a nation very often from a pre-existing nation, has within it minority cultures which have inalienable rights. As distinct from the United States, for example, where the state forms a new national entity, and as a result, in essence, doesn't really have any minorities, no legal minority, with the exception possibly of the Native Americans. Excuse me? Right. With there you have a question. No individual group. There is no majority culture which or at least in theory, or there's major debates. Look at the American political Republican. Anyway, there's a whole mess there going on. I don't want to get. I have enough tsaros. One of the great things now about America is that now I travel to America and I turn on Fox News and I feel good about Israel. Anyway, it's like my problems are less than yours. It's like it's a vacation. Anyway, there are societies in which the majority and the minority constitute, or the different members of the society constitute a dance in which the public space has to ensure that it not represents something which doesn't enable any individual to feel that they're not part of this new national identity. In the context of Israel, of this nation state, where there is a majority and a minority, Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, have inalienable rights here, which we must protect. And where we're not doing so, we have to change the law.
I identify with the sentiment of what you were saying, but I think it's also playing with words in a sense. When you speak of the minority, okay, let me ask you a couple of questions. I happen to be an Arab Palestinian. I want to unite with my wife who happens to live in the West Bank or in Jordan. And there are thousands of people like me. Would you allow it, or you would not allow that? Am I a problem in terms of demography? Because what I'm hearing here that you're, as a minority, you should accept being a minority, and you cannot be ambitious. Now, the step forward you take, that if I become a majority, then your rights are infringed upon in terms of I deny you self-determination or self-expression. This is not the case. I mean, I can imagine a situation. I'm not necessarily arguing for it. Okay? I can imagine a situation where you can live as a Jew the way you would like to live, even though you're a minority. I mean, I mean, why are you denying? I mean, the Palestinians in the West Bank, they have been denied the opportunity to have a state. Also by Israel. Okay, that happened for years, and it's still happening. Now, I mean, how do you decide that? How do you decide? Why isn't the aspiration of a certain group of people to determine a public sphere, just like the Jews want to determine the public sphere, is not legitimate?
Who said it's not legitimate?
You're saying that a minority should accept that.
No, I said a minority doesn't have. Here, you asked a question. Should you be united with your wife? You absolutely should, and I think the Supreme Court was wrong in overturning the ruling. It was absolutely wrong, and it's discriminatory. It has no basis. There's a difference between the law of return, giving preferential treatment to Jews, which is perfectly acceptable, and the discrimination of your citizens here in Israel not being able to be united with their wives under the claim, when the Supreme Court claimed that in doing so, it wasn't being discriminatory because the state doesn't have any obligations towards those who are not citizens, as if those who are citizens aren't being harmed by that. Number one. So you ask the question, the answer would be absolutely yes. Remember, I'm being normative here. I'm not being descriptive. I think in the treatment of Arabs, our descriptive reality is simply inadequate. It's failing. On some levels, it's wonderful. But it's not, we're not yet on this issue a perfect democracy. We're failing. So you ask me, the answer is yes. Can a minority have an aspiration to become a majority? For sure. Do they have a legal right to institute laws that enable them to do so? No. I, as a majority, can protect my status. I have that right. Now, if Israel would become an Arab majority, then it would cease to be Israel. Could I live here? Maybe, but that's not the Israel that I'm yearning to live in. This is the national. I am a people. I want a homeland for my people. I also, by the way, want a homeland for the Palestinian people. And I think the fact that we have preserved an occupation for 40-something years under the status of temporary is problematic. And it is undermining the democracy of Israel. And I believe that just as Israel must be as Jewish only to the extent that democracy allows, Israel has to do everything it needs to do to get out of the West Bank precisely for these principles, so that another people can govern themselves.
But it's building more settlements. So
but who are you talking to? Did I build a settlement? I'm here in the German colony. No, so I'm being. I'm being, again, please, I want to just reiterate. I'm not putting Israel on trial here or not. I am trying to ask, conceptually, can Israel be a Jewish democratic state? The fact that in certain areas we're failing requires of us an educational and political reformation, but not an undermining and accepting that since those who are doing so are failing, I have to give up on the enterprise. That's lunacy. They're doing it wrong, fight for it. You have a notion it could be Jewish and democratic, great. Now build a coalition to make sure that that happens. But to give up on the agenda because at present it's not doing so, I don't think is necessary.
Donniel, that you wouldn't allow the minority to become a majority. If you speak in demographic terms, how far can you go? Will you castrate the minority?
I didn't say I wouldn't, please, if someone will play back the tape, I did not say I wouldn't allow the minority to become a majority. I said the minority doesn't have an inalienable right to dictate to the majority their definition of the public sphere, including they don't have an inalienable right to allow legislation which enables them to be. I'm not talking about castration. That's not what I'm talking about. It's like, this is part of the problem. We get into all these difficulties because we start these voodoo conversations that I don't know where they're coming from. They have nothing, it's like all of a sudden, yes, because, that's right, because I want to ensure a majority, I want to ensure that Ireland remains Ireland, or that Greece remains Greece, or that the United States remains, I'm going to start castrating Mexicans. No one's talking about that. There are ways in which democratic states could preserve their identity. There are ways. And one of them is through immigration. Now, there's things that you could do through immigration. Because the state does not have. Who's censoring?
You're the boss.
The state, there are ways within democracy that you can do this, as long as you function. Outside citizens don't have an inalienable right to the resources of your state. They don't. Every state makes distinctions like this. Universal health care in America. Sorry, it's not universal no more than the World Series is a World Series. It's not. It's American. And it's not universal. It's for citizens of America. Someone in Nigeria can show up and say, oh, I heard you passed universal health coverage. Hi, I'm home. Doesn't work that way. Nation states preserve their identity through law, through ensuring that the citizens who live there are able to maintain the identity of their country. As a majority within the nation state of Israel, I have a right to attempt to do so long as, I remember, we preserve the inalienable rights of the minority. Castration doesn't qualify. And to assume that that's what we're talking about is to demonize the conversation in ways that don't enable the careful, plotting, and moral struggles that we have to deal with. It's just, okay, and it's the same thing with racism. Okay, everything's racist, it's castrated. It's more complicated than that.
You don't have to castrate biologically, you just do it in a civil way. You don't grant nationality to a whole portion of the inhabitants of the land. No, I say you, the state. The state, and in that way, you get rid...
Which state is doing
the state in which you live in, Donniel. Yes.
Why don't you grant citizenship to all the people, the Palestinians in the West Bank?
Because the Palestinians in the West Bank belong to a separate nation state. They belong to a separate, which has to be, again, no, I guess you're talking about borders, within their borders. Why don't I have a right to a nation state? And if, for example, if the Palestinians create a nation state, let's say one day we have a peace treaty. One day we'll have a peace treaty in Shalom. We will have one, and the Palestinians, at least in the international discourse, we're talking about the 67 borders and swaps. What exactly is a swap? We don't know, but that's more or less what everybody's been talking about for the last, I don't know, umpteen years. And the Palestinians are able to create a state within the West Bank and Gaza, within the 67 borders. And when they want to create a state, are they going to be allowed to give preferential immigration rights to fellow Palestinians who live in Arab countries? Of course they will. Will any of you get up and say, excuse me, how are you giving preferential rights to Palestinians to come? Because they're coming home. And this is what it means. I have a nation state, and I want to preserve it as long as I protect the inalienable rights. Now, this is a separate country. Therefore, the issue of territorial compromise is therefore not just a security issue, it's a core challenge required by democracy. And we have to be far more innovative, and we're going to have to take much more risks in order to achieve so. But the enterprise, to delegitimize the enterprise, is what I feel is a language that is part of what you're saying. This is what happens when we decide there's a problem. We give up on the enterprise. Why give up so quickly? It's a great question, and very, very there's so many complex examples that you gave. But let me just give you one example which maybe could help a little bit. You're right, there is a bottom-up, and the bottom-up and the top-down have to speak to each other. Very often, whenever the top speaks, Israel becomes less Jewish. Because the top says you can't grow pig in the state of Israel. So what do Jews do? They build platforms and grow pigs on platforms because it's not the land of Israel. We're a people who sell our leavened bread on chametz. Like, you're not going to stop us. Like, you know, it's like we could do anything. It's like we could have chametz in our house and say, we don't have it. It's not mine. It's not mine. It's like that. So, you know, like, you're never going to, when you try to think you're going to put it from the top down, people are laughing all the way to the bank. It's when it comes, you're not going to parachute it in. But like, take examples of Sabbath, of Shabbat. Take example, like, under the Haredi mayor of Jerusalem, places of non-kosher restaurants and places of entertainment were opened in Jerusalem more than any other mayor prior and since. I can't say since. This mayor is also doing. But what did he do? He said, okay, let's talk. Let's talk. There is a consensus in Jerusalem that there should be a certain form of public observance on Shabbat, given not just the Orthodox, but the traditional population of Jerusalem. But there are minorities who want otherwise. Great. What do we do? Are there places, if you say to me, excuse me, you can't go to a restaurant on Shabbos, I think I can. Now, is there a place that this restaurant could be opened up that won't offend you? If there's no place that it can't be offended, then it's your problem. And what you do is, through the conversation, you reach a sort of a consensus. The gay parade in Jerusalem is a similar example. It's a similar example. It used to be. Now, why did the gay and lesbian community want to march in Jerusalem? What? The Pride Parade. The Pride Parade. Why do they want to march in Jerusalem? They want to march in Jerusalem because Jerusalem's the capital. Jerusalem can't be the capital, on the one hand, and not be open to various people, various sensitive, say, that's my capital too. But the problem is that for some crazy reason, someone decided that the only place that a parade occurs in Jerusalem is on Yafo Street. Why is Yafo Street the parade street of Jerusalem? Conceptually, it's a difficult question. Why is there a problem? Yafo is 100 meters from Mea Sharim. If the only place to march in Jerusalem is Yafo, then we have a problem. The Supreme Court says you're going to march. But now get to work on working on a consensus. And sit down. Could we work? Is there another road that you could feel you're in Jerusalem and, we find out there's Agron. We can go up Agron, and then we can go down Keren Yesod, and we could end up in this corrupt neighborhood over here in southern Jerusalem where nobody really cares, and everybody's fine. So this is when there's a combination of the top, of setting standards, but it's not just the government. It's our language, it's our educators, it's our principles. When we have a principle of how we want to think about it, and then the bottom up starts talking, when you have that synergy, then you begin to, then you're going to build something. It's when you think you're going to stop, you're going to do only half of it, you're going to fall over yourself, and you're not going to be able to build the type of country that we want to have.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's getting late. At least one of us needs to get back home, and home is very far from here, up in the Galilee. So, thank you, the audience, for your patience. Thank you, the panelists.